the recording and welcome everybody from around the world, the hundreds of participants already here with us tonight on season 3 now of the University of Queensland and State University of Sao Paulo's online seminar series, International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning. We're back through a third season with another selection of 10 world-renowned scholars, researchers, practitioners in the field of corpus technology for language learning purposes. And tonight we have with us Dr. Dana Gablasova from University of Lancaster in the UK, who's going to present on using the British National Corpus 2014 in language teaching. It's just a fantastic resource, which is kind of still, to me, kind of recent, even though it's like 2014, which is like 8 years ago. How the passage of time does fly. That's the way things have gone, especially in this post-pandemic world. But it's still one of the newest and latest resources that is available to us as corpus linguists, researchers, teachers, and practitioners. And we're going to find out today about how that resource can be used for language learning. Our speaker today, Dr. Gablasova, is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Linguistics and English Language and a researcher in the ESRC-funded Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Science at Lancaster University. In analyzing large-scale corpora of learner English, including the Trinity Lancaster Corpus and the British Council Lancaster Aptis Corpus, and applying corpus research to language teaching and testing. She also leads a Corpus for Schools project focusing on the practical implementation of corpora into language teaching. And Dr. Gablasova offers free corpus-based English teaching materials. She's also the academic director of the annual Lancaster Summer Schools in Corpus Linguistics. Who says we do not have the best speakers on this series? We certainly do, and we're very honored to have one of the best here with us tonight. So, Dr. Gablasova, I'm going to hand over to you, and the floor is yours. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Now, there was one thing that Dana did mention at the beginning of the talk, and that was that her internet tonight may cut out periodically. Hello, Tatiana, as one of our speakers from the last season, just showed up there on the screen. Good to see you. And I think we'd better kill some time before Dana reappears back in the room. So how are you, Tatiana? Is everything good with you? You can unmute. You're still muted, sorry.
I'm in the process of moving offices, so everything is a bit shaky at the moment. But
okay,
you know, I'm okay. Yes, I'm glad that you carry on this series. It's amazing. So yeah, and I always wanted to listen to Dana as well, because it is something that I do and can get a lot of information from her. Yeah.
Okay, as I said, we're just waiting for her to reappear. I'm sure she will not be too much longer. In the meantime, hello everybody else from around the world. We're already up to, there she is in the room. So I'll just let her back into the room as we go. These things do happen in the wonderful world of international talk. So we've got Dana back, and there she is. You did mention that this might happen, and it happened right off the bat. So that's great. But hopefully it's not going to happen during your talk.
Yeah, I very much hope, and yeah, I apologize if there's small cuts. It usually comes back very soon.
Yeah, not an issue at all. Okay, I'm going to hand over to you right away, so you can share your screen.
Is it time to share the screen? Yeah.
It's time. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Peter, for your introduction and for inviting me to this fantastic seminar series. And can I just check whether you can hear me well? If you just say something more.
That's great. Yeah, everything's looking good, and then we can hear you great.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. So as Peter said, today I'm going to talk about how we can use the new British National Corpus 2014 in language teaching. And I'm going to introduce BNClab, the interface that we've built for this purpose. And experimenting and working with data is a very powerful and effective way of learning new knowledge and skills. And pictures such as these, seeing students in labs working with data, are very common in fields such as chemistry, biology, and physics, and that's what they may be associated with. But learning from data has also had a long tradition in language pedagogy, in the form of data-driven learning. As you probably know very well if you are regular participants in this seminar series. So data-driven learning, just a very short recap here, is a form of corpus-based learning in which we take evidence from a corpus, examples, data, and by corpus we mean an electronic database of language samples. And we use this evidence to search for patterns in language use and to draw students' attention to these patterns, and we expose them to these patterns. And this is a very effective method of language learning, as quite a lot of research evidence has shown us to date. And I've just included two relatively recent meta-analyses here. Reference to these meta-analyses. Meta-analyses are studies that review a lot of evidence from individual empirical studies. So these studies, both the individual studies and the meta-analyses, have found and confirmed that data-driven learning is indeed very effective at and results in improving language skills and knowledge of students, but it also works well in terms of students' motivation and them enjoying the learning process. So some of the major benefits of this type of learning are from the cognitive perspective. The benefits lie in students being exposed to natural distribution of patterns in language use, for example, such as collocations or formulaic units, and this allows and helps the implicit acquisition of these patterns and for implicit learning. And we know from other research that implicit knowledge is often more automatized in our minds and in learners' minds, and it leads to a more fluent use of this knowledge. So, for example, in processing or production of language. There are large pedagogical benefits. We know that when we teach a language that is authentic, so for example, it was used by real users in real settings, it is easier to transfer this knowledge from the classrooms to the environment outside of the classroom. And this in turn really works, improves students' motivation because they themselves know they're working with authentic language. And thus they're getting ready for these real life situations outside of the classroom, which helps with their confidence in using the language and their willingness to use it. So this is one group of benefits of data-driven learning. Data-driven learning also draws on the principles of discovery learning. And discovery learning is one of major educational theories and methods from 1960s. It is part of the constructivist tradition of language learning. And just to summarize its principle, again, in very kind of simple terms, of course, it is quite well-developed theory, but the main idea is to present students with data and evidence and guide them so that they can use their existing knowledge and experience in order to discover new facts or relationships by themselves, or they can expand their existing knowledge further by themselves. So there are several benefits of this teaching approach as well. So from the cognitive perspective, the knowledge that students have to work at getting, at attaining, they have to engage with the data here to get at the knowledge. This type of knowledge will be more robust from the cognitively, and the students will retain it for longer than if they were just presented with facts or rules and asked to practice them. This has, of course, also some positive consequences for their motivation. Students find it very empowering to experience that they, as learners, can discover new knowledge by themselves, that they don't always have to rely on a teacher or wait for the class to take place. So again, this leads to an increase in their confidence as learners, as those acquiring and using the new knowledge, in our case, new language, second language, or additional language. And from a pedagogical perspective, when students engage in this type of learning, they also gain experience with self-directed and autonomous learning. And this, again, is very important because we know that it is really important for students not to stop learning once the classes stop or once the school year stops, but to keep acquiring the language by themselves and know, and for them to know how to do it. So here I very briefly summarize some of the major benefits of data-driven learning and some of the principles it draws on. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how we can use the British National Corpus 2014, this really huge and amazing data set with thousands of language samples. So how we can use it in data-driven learning, so that we can draw on the various benefits that this learning method offers. So that's the plan for today. Right. So first, let me introduce and briefly describe the corpus, so the data set that we're using. So the British National Corpus 2014, it is called 2014 because the data come from around this period. So it represents language from around this period. But Peter, it is actually not that old in terms of when it was completed, because the corpus was completed only last year, at the end of last year, and the last component was released in November 2021. So it's a very recent resource from this perspective, and yeah, large corpora take a very long time to put together. So now the corpus contains 100 million words from almost 90,000 files. It represents 8 main large genres and 52 sub-genres. It consists of 2 major components, the spoken and the written component. The spoken component contains 10 million words from nearly 700 speakers that were engaged in about over 1,000 conversations, and the data come from informal conversations, so everyday conversations between family and friends. And this is a very valuable type of data, because this type of interaction is typically very hard to get at. If you're interested in reading more about this part of the British National Corpus 2014, I've put a reference there. It is freely accessible, so we can have a look at it. The second major component of BNC 2014 is the written component. It contains 90 million words from different genres, and the genres that we typically may include in large general corpora, such as academic prose, fiction, newspapers, magazines. But there's also the genre of e-language, which I think is very interesting for us today, of course, because it has not been included in some of the older corpora. And this genre further contains the subgenres of, for example, text messages, emails, tweets, Facebook posts. And again, if you're interested in this part of the component of British National Corpus 2014, I've included a reference here. It is also freely accessible. Also, the whole corpus is freely accessible. If you want to search in it, you can do so through Lancsbox at Lancaster University. And I can give you a reference then after the talk. Right, so what I'm going to talk about next is how we, what we did in order to give people access to this wonderful data set for learning purposes. So in order to get these data sets into classrooms and get it to teachers and students, we've created BNClab, which is a platform, really a language, which is a language laboratory that allows you to go into this corpus and explore it, explore the spoken and written components, and to really, what we wanted to create was to give people a user-friendly interface to interact with this corpus and to use data from this corpus. And the platform, BNClab, contains 2 large samples from 2 major corpora, so not only BNC 2014. So, but first of all, it contains 2 large samples from BNC 2014 that are balanced in terms of social characteristics of the speakers. So we have a 5 million sample representing informal conversations between British English speakers, and we have a 5 million sample representing different genres of current written British English. There's 1 million per each large genre. But what we also included in BNClab is a sample from the British National Corpus, the original British National Corpus that was built in 1990s. And we included a 5 million sample representing informal conversations between British English speakers from the 1990s. So this is directly comparable with the 5 million sample of more current speech from BNC 2014. So with this composition of the data, the students can focus, for example, on exploring the current language use, current English, but they can also look at the changes in British English over the period of 20 or 30 years, and they can explore variation in language use according to various social factors, such as gender, region, or age, and I will demonstrate this in greater detail. So before I show you the interface in more detail, let me just talk a little bit about the kind of pedagogical motivation also behind what is in BNClab, and in a way our philosophy behind creating it. So first of all, as I said, we wanted to focus on current English use and help and allow teachers and students to learn about current English use while using this data set. So we wanted them to be students to be able to explore questions such as what does spoken interactive communication looks like today, or how do spoken and written communication differ from each other. We also wanted to focus on social factors that affect language use, because we feel these are sometimes not that well represented in the teaching materials that are available to us today, or not so much highlighted or stressed in the teaching of English still. So we wanted students to be able to explore questions such as how does language vary according to different uses and social settings. And finally, we also wanted to be able for students to be able to talk, to explore questions related to the pragmatic aspects of language use, and to ask, for example, how does language choice affect people's communication, and to look into this with data. We were also, with BNClab and making BNC 2014 available in this form, we were also responding to what we perceived as a practical need of giving students and teachers access to data that would be large enough to have so that they can explore different topics, different linguistic features, and that is systematically collected, and that gives access to current spoken and written British English, and it can then be used either in a classroom, but it can also be used by students for their individual projects outside of the class. Also, BNClab reflects our genuine and strong belief in research-led teaching. And by creating it, we wanted it to be based on a very recent corpus resources. As I said, BNC 2014 only became available last year in full to the researchers, to the research community. So we wanted it to be based on recent corpus based for linguistics, linguistic findings about language use. And we wanted students to be able to discover these findings for themselves. So I find it quite exciting that as we are, and as researchers around the world, are now exploring BNC 2014 and looking in it for patterns, for new insights about language use, students in their classrooms at the very same time can be doing the kind of same types of research studies and explorations. And I'm really glad that by creating BNClab, we were able to cut the cycle of, when a resource is first made available to researchers, then they research and they publish on it, then the information reaches textbooks, and then students can learn from it. So we wanted to kind of create a shortcut in this process. So also, we, as I said, wanted to draw on the benefits of data-driven learning by exposing learners to authentic language, give them a chance to engage in discovery learning, so discover patterns in language use for themselves, and to, of course, offer them the flexibility of topics and materials that can be created using the resource. We also hope to bring some innovation into the data-driven learning and this type of interfaces where students access corpus data via a certain platform or an interface, pedagogically oriented interface. So here we were addressing and responding to the issues and challenges that have been raised in this type of learning. For example, one of the issues and challenges that is quite often reported is that students have problems with interpreting quantitative data from a corpus, with finding patterns and understanding the patterns. So through the type of visualization that we included on the website, we tried to help the students in this respect. So let me now show you the interface and the functionality in BNClab. So this is what BNClab looks like before anything is typed into it, and you see it is everything is gray. And once you type your query in, the data gets loaded, and you can start exploring the various functionalities. And you can do all sorts of searches in here, search for words, phrases, etc. I'll talk about that in a little moment. This is where you can access BNClab for yourself. So let us first look at the various buttons that are available in BNClab that give you access to the data. Well, first of all, we have the usage button that gives access to the very usual, probably the most fundamental view that we method in corpus linguistics, which is concordance lines. So you can go and look at those. The gender button will show frequencies in the data according to the female and male users. And you see here we have data for 1994 and 2014. If you click on one of these, you can turn it off and just be looking at the current use, or you can leave it on. So here we immediately see that the word sick is used fewer times by male speakers than by female speakers. Of course, it is very important to look into concordance lines, because we would see that it is not women talking more about being sick, but often them being in caring roles and talking about other people being sick. If you click on some of these bars, that would take you to the concordance automatically for this group. So for example, for women from 2014 data set. and you can explore it. We have the age button that would show us the age distribution of the speakers. Again, we can switch off one of the corpora if we want to, just see the more recent data. So we see that young speakers use it quite often. And again, if you look into the concordances, the data, you would see that this is to a large extent caused by the fact that young speakers do not necessarily talk about sick as being ill, but they're also using it in this data set to mean that something is cool, that movie is sick. So we see that a little bit in the distribution. Then we have a change button, and we see just the difference in the use between 1990s and in the BNC 2014. So for example, for words such as anxious or stressed, we would see an increase in the use. The social class button will show us use according to different social classes that were included in British National Corpus, both of them. Again, we can click on the bars and be taken to the data for this particular group of speakers. With the region box, we can explore how language is used in different parts of the UK. So here, for example, I looked at the use of them plus plural noun, which is one of regional features of language use in the UK. So for example, in sentences such as little better out with all them boxes, I remember them tree roots coming out, and you would be able to see where this feature is more dominant in the UK. And finally, this is the newest feature in BNClab that was just added the second part of last year, and that's the comparison of speech and writing. And you can see how a certain word phrase is used in different genres. Again, you can click on it and see what is happening there and explore the data further. In terms of the searches, as I said, we can look for words, expressions, and then explore them a bit further. We can look at word classes, so just say search walk as a noun. There's also some predefined semantic categories that we can search for in BNClab, such as color terms, technology terms, terms related to emotions. And we can do a bit more complex searches. So for example, here it's combining the grammatical information with specific word search. So this is the basic functionality of BNClab. And now I want to talk a little bit about what sort of questions students can explore with BNClab. So we can, of course, as I said, explore current language use, just to look at it from a linguistic perspective, what's going on in language. We can look at a change in language, but we can also explore beliefs about language or social factors in language use. And with all of these, we can use the data from BNClab, the linguistic data, to talk with our students and to explore in a way the world around us. Things such as how society, values, lifestyle norms are connected with and reflected in language. And just to illustrate some of these sorts of searches, how we can integrate this into these sort of questions into our classes. Here we can look at beliefs that students may have about language or attitudes that they know other people have about language. And here I'm looking at a report on a survey that was done by British Board of Film Classification, in which they asked people about their attitudes and beliefs about their use of swear words, and they approached 1,000 people. And if you want to read more about it, it was quite widely reported in the UK. So there are these references where you can go and check on it. But some of the things that they found that people said about their own use of swear words are these. So, for example, they reported there is a generation divide when it comes to swearing, with 46% of Generation Z, that is people born after 1996, saying they frequently use strong language. That compares with only 12% for people aged 55 to 64. So this is what people reported about themselves, what they believe about their use. So what we, for example, can do is to look at some swear words in BNClab and look at the age distribution in there, and to see that indeed Generation Z does seem to be more liberal in their use of at least the swear words that I put into the search. Another finding related, I think, to the gender of the speakers, and the report said that about a third of people say they use strong language more than they did 5 years ago. The figure is slightly higher for women than men. So here we have both language change and the gender. So again, there are students, we could go to explore this in BNClab and see what is going on in terms of the actual language use when we compare this to the beliefs. We can also explore, for example, language use in relation to social trends. And I already looked at this, showed this one finding, the use of anxious, stressed, or depressed. So, for example, if we looked at how the use changed over the years between BNC from 1990s and BNC, British National Corpus, that represents a more current use, we would see an increase. And actually, this was the difference was statistically significant in the use. And with our students, we could discuss this because, of course, this does not mean that people are necessarily more anxious or stressed or depressed, although they may well be. But what this may suggest is that for some reason, they keep using these words more often in informal conversations. And with our students, we could explore, we could go further into this, for example, have our attitudes towards mental health and what is publicly acceptable to be talked about, not changed, etc. And there are similar trends related to, for example, words such as vegan, vegetarian, gym. Again, this does not unfortunately mean that people may be going to the gym more often, but it may reflect something more related to our lifestyle and attitudes towards language or social values. So all things that can be explored with BNClab. So now I'm going to turn to some more practical questions, and that is how to actually bring BNClab into English language classrooms. What can we do with it? What sort of exercises we can put together and do? So of course, we can do both. We can go with our students online if we have access to computers in a class, or ask them to do searches online, or we can create paper-based exercises based on BNClab. And we know from loads of research on data-driven learning that both work really well. Also, we can just use BNClab occasionally, something as a fun activity with students, or we can create more kind of substantial systematic lessons based on it. So here I'm going to give an example of a few types of kind of the exercises and ways in which we can bring BNClab data to our students in kind of a one-off exercise, how we can integrate the information from BNClab into a class. So first of all, we can bring in information about frequency related to language use. And we can do this in narrative format, tell our students about it, about data, or we can also show them a graph and let them interpret it. So here is an example of search term you guys, and this is taken from a lesson on pronouns and pronoun change, kind of use of pronouns in current English, but also thinking about whether it may have changed. The lesson was introduced, for example, by saying that pronouns are often considered to be relatively straightforward, and it is believed that unlike adwords, they do not change much. But this is not entirely true, because corpus evidence tells us otherwise. So when we look at how pronouns are used by British English speakers in their communication today, we can see some interesting patterns and changes developing over time. And then we can say that if you looked in BNC, for example, for the expressions such as you guys, we see actually quite a dramatic rise in the use of this expression. And then we can let students explore and think about why this is the case. We can ask students to search for and discover patterns for themselves in a corpus. We can give them the search terms, words, grammatical structures to search for, or we can of course ask them to formulate their own question. And here is an example of such a search from a lesson on the age effect, how people talk about emotions. So this class explored actually how different social groups talk about emotion, and whether young people have different words than older people, and whether there are different patterns. So for example, there was an exercise in which students were asked to look at some exclamations. They were asked to form a hypothesis of whether this would be typical more for younger or older people, and then they went to check the evidence for this in BNClab, and they could just add their own word to search for or exclamation. Finally, also a very kind of classic type of exercise, we can ask students to interpret a pattern from the data from the corpus. We can show students just concordance lines, larger extracts that illustrate a pattern that we would like them to discover, to learn about, and ask them to have a go at it. So for example, in this task, we were looking at singular, the use of singular they in current spoken British English, and the students were deciding whether the they in the sentence refers to a singular or third person plural. And what works really well is when is contrasting different patterns, so it is easy for students to discover. So for example, we can do all of these. Right, so now I've given you some examples of some typical exercises, types of exercises that we can integrate BNC 2014 material and data into, and how we can create our own materials, create our own exercises. But in BNClab, in the project, we've also created some materials, and we keep creating some teaching materials that teachers can just download and use, adapt, use some of it, use whole worksheets with their students. And the materials we create as part of this project all have a similar structure. There is the introduction of the topic, which is usually formulated as a question that students would be discovering the answer to. And what follows is a series of tasks. And these tasks are a combination of practical discovery of patterns. There's some productive language tasks when they're practicing a certain linguistic feature, a function. Then there's space for discussing the findings. And we've also created each worksheet for students has an accompanying worksheet for teachers, because we don't want teachers necessarily to do the discovering for themselves all of the time. They have other things to do. So I'm going to finish the talk by giving you examples, showing you examples and talking you through some of these worksheets, so you know what you can find there. And there's some main topics, kind of main categories of worksheets that we've created. One category is one set of teaching materials, focuses on current spoken English. And some of the worksheets, for example, address questions such as, why does English keep on changing? So, which might be relevant for more advanced learners. We look at lexical changes in English related to technology. We look at lexical changes related to health and talking about health. For example, the materials, the worksheets that look at more grammatical features in spoken English today, such as the change in the use of pronouns and the use of singular they. Another group of materials, that's another category, that kind of another set of materials focuses on developing students' communicative skills. So, for example, the topics such as how to disagree politely in spoken English, and we look at different examples of disagreements that could be considered more direct or indirect, and again, students are discovering a pattern here and can discuss the also how they perceive polite, what they perceive to be polite or impolite, how we achieve this in English, etc. Another worksheet that focuses on spoken communication today actually looks at the use of swear words in spoken English, and we thought this is quite important because there are not that many teaching materials that look at swearing in spoken English, while when we look at corpus evidence, swear words are relatively frequent in informal communication today, and they have different functions. So actually, if we're preparing students for everyday communication, and for example, if they need to function in the UK, maybe coming to a university here, it is good for them to be prepared for this aspect of communication as well. Another example of materials from the category of spoken communication looks at what spoken English really looks like and how fluent it is, how fluent is spoken L1 English. And for example, this particular worksheet was designed to help both teach students about English and about communication, but also to help with their confidence and their willingness to communicate, because we also know from teaching that students are often reluctant to speak, and L2 learners are quite conscious of not being fluent, of hesitating, of not being able to find the right word, and they attribute it often to their communication as L2 speakers, to their lack of proficiency in L2 speech. So in this handout, using BNC 2014 data, we are showing L2 learners how common this is actually in spoken communication in people's first language. So some exercises from this handout, for example, brings together examples of L1 and L2 English. So the L1 examples are from BNC 2014, and students are asked to guess which come from the native speakers and which come from the non-native speakers. And then we're also exploring the various disfluencies. And of course, it actually is proving quite difficult for them to guess and they are learning, discovering the message in a way that L1 communication can be very disfluent as well. Another exercise from this handout asks students to go into BNClab and search for the expression, what's the word? This is what we say when we experience a lexical gap and we can't think of the word to use. So we're talking and say like, what's the word? And what they'll discover when they type this into BNClab is that this is very common in L1 communication. And the exercise then asks them to look at the various what sort of words L1 speakers could not come up with in the course of the communication. So it is quite an interesting exercise. If you're interested in this sort of materials, you can find them there's a link either to BNClab, or you can find them on this link, and it is a link to our larger project, Corpus for Schools, that BNClab platform is part of. And in this project, the major aims of this project are to bring corpora and corpus methods into classrooms, to teach students about the use of the English language, and give them access to authentic English communication. We want to draw on the benefits of discovery learning and problem-based learning, as we did with BNC 2014. And the aim is also to provide free corpus resources for students and teachers. So if you're interested in this, please do visit the website and leave your comment. We invite feedback, suggestions, ideas, etc. So thank you very much for listening to this talk, to my presentation. And if you have any questions, any comments, I will be very happy to respond to them. And I think Peter has been looking at the chat. So should I stop sharing?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Dana. And thanks so much for a wonderful talk. There's been an absolute ton of interest, as promised. We had 232 participants in the room at present, which I believe may have broken the record for the first speaker from season 2, Tatiana, who is in the room, so hopefully she doesn't feel too bad about that. But it's just the way the word has spread over time. It's a wonderful talk. I'm still getting 1 or 2 questions in. I've made a note of the questions that have come through. So what I'm going to do is to try to monitor that chat as well as ask some of the questions that I've got. I'm going to start with a question about the teaching materials. This question is from Umut Salihoglu. The question is, will the BNC 2014 teaching materials have suggested answers for teacher use?
So as I said, for each of these worksheets, there exists a teacher teaching sheet, we call it teacher notes. So if you go to Corpus for Schools website and you find this worksheet, there's always an attached teaching sheet. I think we're just missing one that has not been finished. We kind of sometimes add them a tiny bit later. Basically, it has usually answers for the questions, suggested pedagogical activities. Sometimes there are no clear answers because we ask students to discuss. So there's some suggested areas that in which you may kind of guide students' discussion. So we did prepare this because, as I said, we did not want the teachers to necessarily go on and discovering all of this for themselves. They're often very busy.
Okay, yeah, really interesting. And thanks for also posting the link there to the Corpus for Schools resource, Gang Yao. We have the link there, and anybody else who wants the link can contact Dana or myself at any time. I just had a look there at the website, so the link does seem to work, and I think certainly it's the first time also that I've seen this resource, so I'm going to be spending some time to look through that as well and to try to share some of the works. Alex Bolton just said the teacher notes are password protected, so maybe that's something that might be.
That's we say, can you email us about the password? This actually BNClab came about as we collaborated very closely with schools and teachers as we've been developing the materials. As you can imagine, we started with some ideas, tried it on teachers. They said not in too complex for the classroom, etc. So it went through various iterations till we reached this sort of structure. And one thing that the teachers raised were, well, but if this is so easily accessible on the website, we ask students to do this for homework or as presentation, they'll just click and look at the teaching notes. This, would be too easy for them. So basically what we did as a result is we protected the teaching notes with a password. We'll give it very easily to teachers when they email us, because the teachers, when we said wouldn't it still be too easy, and they said they actually thought the students would not necessarily bother kind of emailing to and saying their teachers, etc. So just drop us an email. There's the email and we'll give it out. Yeah.
Okay.
Very
thank you very
easy.
much. I got a question from Sean Murphy, who asked, have you yet published the results of any research of using those worksheets yet?
No, we haven't done any formal research on this. We're open to doing actually research with some teachers or researchers. If they're interested, we're also collaborating on a more formal research with some universities where they are using the resources. So there may be something coming. Otherwise, we just collect feedback from teachers, and that has been very, very useful. So in terms of what works, what doesn't, and we've incorporated it actually into also some of the existing worksheets.
Yeah, that's really good, and it's great to see more of these resources become available online, and with the view that eventually they will become shareable and available for the general public. We had Ellen LaFoll's work website on the press books in the last season, which has been very well received. Quite a few other resources out there, so we're starting to see an uptick in the availability of the resources, and certainly the resources that you've shown us tonight look incredibly high quality. And as you said, they've gone through a number of rounds of kind of differentiation between what was originally planned and then what the teachers have said the students can do. And this is just something we see when we try to build materials like this together. So yeah, really exciting times there. I've had a few other questions about the BNC 2014. One question from Anila, who asks, how is the corpus of spoken English constructed? What recordings of spoken language were used, and how were they transcribed in the corpus? So you might not have to give a very lengthy answer, but just a brief overview of how that corpus was built and what's in there.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just gave very brief description. So that part of the corpus was built in cooperation between Lancaster University and Cambridge University Press, and it represents largely, as I said, informal conversations between friends and family. And it is quite interesting because compared to BNC, one from 1990s that also contains a 10 million component of informal conversation, the method was very different because in the past, people had to be equipped with a recording device. And in BNC 2014, one of the main methods was actually asking people to record their conversations on their mobile phones. Of course, after everybody gave appropriate permissions, and the other people were informed. And so they could then submit that, send it over, and it was transcribed at the university. I mean, as for transcription guidelines, these were developed at CAS. We use them and adapt them for a number of our spoken corpora. And for it is best to have a look at the reference that I put into the slides, and I believe the slides will be made available. So it is freely accessible, both of the references, and they give more details about, basically, they just focus on the methodology and description of the corpus, including the transcription guidelines.
I did get a couple of questions, but maybe you can answer very briefly. I know that you've just referred us to the resources on the corpus, but a couple of people did ask, were the interactions sometimes between, say, immigrants or between non-native speakers with other non-native speakers? Were they all native speaker interaction? Are there interactions in English as a lingua franca, for example? Do you happen to know much details about that?
Not massive details, but what I know is that the people who were transcribed in the corpus, including, had to be native British English speakers. That means they could have spoken another language, but they identified British English. I think there was definition was this was the language I spoke at home since I was a child, or I was born. So actually, this may include people from immigrant backgrounds and speak of multilingual speakers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've got a couple more questions, maybe or three more before we wrap up. Question from another Peter, which is just the best name. Said, hello Dana, thank you for your very interesting presentation. Is there a guide for students about how to search for specific grammatical structures, like a corpus query language guide for BNClab?
On the BNClab platform, actually on the top, there is help. It's called, and there is a guide for searching. Although it is much simpler than any CQL or language, because that was the whole point of students being able to type. So the kind of notation, there's the biggest thing I think we include are the brackets or capital letters for grammatical words. And it's a combination of this, but there's the look at that, the guide in there.
And when searching for lexicogrammatical patterns, are the part of speech tags available? This question is from Alpha Benamor.
So the corpus is tagged for parts of speech. I said we can search for walk as a noun as opposed to work as a verb, but we don't have to use any sort of tags. You just say walk noun, walk I want to say walk adjective, walk verb, and followed by it, and it will automatically search for it.
That's great. I don't suppose it's possible just to, I don't know if you want to do this, just to maybe share the screen and just give us a look at how that might work, like just to run a search through BNClab. Do you have something, are you able to do that?
I would, I may not, because I've got all sorts of websites.
Yeah, no, that's okay, not to worry.
So I think if I now started switching, I'm not going to like sharing if it is all right.
We'll leave the investigations to the audience.
I could have prepared it, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've got one more kind of question related to the nature of the activities and the relationship between inductive activities, where the students then are led kind of down a path of corpus queries and searching for things and looking at the evidence and reflecting on what happens, and from that inducing the language elements of what it is that they're looking for, and hopefully that's where the acquisition is occurring. So in context though, where that kind of learning approach is less common, where in more teacher-fronted contexts, for example, the question is, can we, are there a number of activities within your materials, or do you think that there is a place for more deductive type activities within your materials, or in general for where the teachers kind of really giving the information to the students and the students are following that, rather than leaving the emphasis of the detective work, so to speak, on the students themselves? And I get asked this all the time, so I think it's a good question for you.
Yeah, so I think, you know, that there is both. This is quite a, you know, quite a flexible resource, in the sense of, for example, if you think about, you know, I showed you one example of an activity with the you guys search, right? That would get us to the information about that this is something that is now very common in spoken British English, and it was not common before. So we could actually, this is a fact, right, based on the frequency, and we could let students to find this. We could students then discuss the answers, so kind of arrive at what is happening. We could show them, and I'm giving this a bit away, we could ask them to search the exercise where this is embedded, is then asking them to search for expressions such as you all, you too, you people, and they would see a rise in all of these expressions, right? So seeing a pattern, and they could then discover this for themselves, what is happening. But of course, as a teacher, what we can do is to work with this finding, because we may just want to teach the students that this is, in a way, what is going on, that this is a common expression, and we may want to tell them why this is the case in current British English. You know, we may just do this in that form and let them practice these expressions that we know they will meet today. So I see a lot of flexibility of how the information from the corpus is used, and in what way you decide to incorporate it. I think it is worthwhile either way, and we can just scaffold the discovering, you know, in very different ways, and we can also decide on the kind of depth or range of the engagement, whether this is something they'll be discovering for, you know, 3 lessons, or whether the discovery bit would involve 5 minutes of brainstorming over the material.
Absolutely. And this is something that the teachers know best themselves. The teachers know the abilities of their students and where they're up to. And even within a particular class, there may be groups of students who will need those more deductive activities to begin with, and other students who can launch straight into the more inductive work. But that's the case with all kind of, I guess, classroom activity that you might consider in a language learning context. So, where data-driven learning is no different in that regard, in terms of the way that things are sequenced and the way that they're presented to students in that kind of scaffolded way. And the teacher and the applied linguist has a big role to play in managing that effectively. So, thank you. I think that's all of the questions that we have time for today. So, yeah, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So, and I'm mindful that it's now 10 o'clock here in Brisbane. So I'm going to wrap up the session here. And I'd like to thank again our presenter, Dr. Dana Gablasova, on a wonderful talk and a wonderful introduction to this third season now of the International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning. I'm just going to introduce very briefly then our presenter for next week. And this one will be on a Friday evening on the 30th of September. We have Dr. Yukio Tono from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and he's going to be looking at using corpora for reference level descriptions of the Common European Framework for Languages and the Common European Framework for Japanese, which is something new to me, and I'm sure it's going to be of interest to a lot of you. But you can see the thanks are coming in thick and fast through the chat. And again, thanks, Dana. Do you have any final kind of comments or thoughts before we wrap up?
Thank you very much for listening. Perhaps one tiny comment on BNClab and Corpus for Schools. I kind of thought the practical advice: when you go to the website, you'll see two types of materials, ELT materials and A-level materials. This is for British secondary schools. We've kind of divided them, but basically we'll probably rework this a little bit, because both of the materials are relevant to ELT, and the A-level materials might be suitable for a bit more advanced students perhaps, but I would just encourage you, if you go there, to explore both, because they may be relevant. So otherwise, just thank you very much for listening to this talk and attending it in very different time zones, which is quite
That's the nature of the game. We've got a few speakers in from the US this time, so there may be some other time changes coming up soon as well. For those of you who are in Brazil, our Brazilian team have probably just all woken up and are about to have their breakfast, so go ahead and enjoy that. But for the rest of you, we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks for another great session, and we'll see you all next week. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye-bye.